Good morning. Welcome to our little workshop this morning on financial planning for a sustainable future. I have some animations in here that I forgot about because it's supposed to say Amy, Michael, and Jamae Marsh here bringing you this. We're going to do introductions in just a second. And we'll be off video for that. And then what I'd love to have you do while we're introducing ourselves is to put your name and organization in the chat. If you feel like it, maybe pop in a question or a learning goal or something that's on your mind as we're thinking about sort of this longer term planning and planning for a sustainable future for our organizations. And then just a note on logistics, couple notes on logistics. One, please ask questions as we go. We've got a good group, 14 people, about 10 participants and 4 of us that are doing moderating and tech on our side. So please feel free to just jump in. You can use the chat. You can use raise your hand if that makes you feel better, but I don't always see those. Or you can just talk. And then we are going to be recording the presentation today, but the lovely folks at Cascadia Consulting are actually going to go back and edit out all the identifiable commentary and chats that go on. So I want you to feel really free to talk about your organization, and it will not show up on CNN later if you say something that you're like, oh, we shouldn't have said that. So we're gonna cut out all the comments and just have a recording of the formal part. I mean, that doesn't count for Jamae. Jamae's stories will all be included too, unless they don't want us to. All right, so that's the logistics. My name is Amy Michael. I may have met quite a few of you. I work with Communities of Opportunity doing financial coaching, and I also do these workshops. I am a consultant. I teach at Seattle U in the Masters in Nonprofit Leadership program, and I'm very excited about working with organizations shoulder to shoulder to think about how to incorporate more financial sustainability, financial education. I recognize that finance world, the world of money and the economy is a really historically racist and oppressive system. And as a white person, I have particular access to that privilege. And so I get excited about doing this work, particularly with communities of opportunity, because I want to share the knowledge that I have to help try to really dismantle the systems of oppression or the barriers that keep all of us out of the good conversations that we want to have about sustainability, and think about different ways to leverage finance conversations and know-how for good. That's where I'm coming from. And I'm delighted that Jamae Marsh, who is the executive director at Feast, is joining me today, a participant in the Communities of Opportunity world also, and a really brilliant leader of a fantastically dynamic organization, who's agreed to be with us today. And Jamae, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Jamae Marsh. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the executive director of Feast. Just a little bit of background on me. I'm from the social work, public health, and community organizing realm. I've been a youth organizer since I was a young person, starting in high school and having always worked at youth-led or youth-driven organizations throughout my career. I've been executive director of Feast for 4 years and also had previously been on the board and a volunteer for the organization. So love it so much. Just couldn't stay away. And I'm from Spokane, Washington. I've been living in Seattle off and on for 20 years. And, with some time to do travel and some international studies as well. But, Seattle is my home for all intents and purposes, but I'm broadcasting live today from Los Angeles. I'm actually here for a conference of youth organizers, which is really cool. So happy to also be here. And personally, I'm a person who loves to cook, travel, and low key, I'm a gamer. I was just sharing with Amy my love for playing Just Dance to get pumped up and get more movement in my body. So those are some things about me. And I've had the opportunity to work with Amy, especially around the development of a multi-year budgeting tool that has really helped me with my own strategic planning. And so that's some of the story that I'll be sharing with you all today.
Thank you very much, Jemay. We also have Caroline here today from Cascadia Consulting, and we also have Alyssa from Cascadia Consulting, Alyssa's doing our tech, and we're grateful for that, and grateful for the support of that organization also. In fact, let me pull up the next slide as if I wrote them myself. Oh, there we go. Look at that. Some acknowledgements. The workshop is supported by the Communities of Opportunity Learning Community. And that's an initiative, as you all know, that was catalyzed in 2014 by King County, the Seattle Foundation. And it creates this great community and cohort of folks who come together and share their learning and their wisdom. I feel very privileged to be a little part of that. And I'm excited that they have provided the opportunity to talk with you today. All right, so we're gonna just dive right in. Any questions or comments, please feel free to pop them in. Thank you all for introducing yourself. We've got a cool array of organizations. Today's learning objectives for the workshop are, we're gonna look at ways to improve our operational and strategic, the relevance of our planning process. So really, one of the focuses today will be to really incorporate our values and our real goals into the way we do our planning. We'll also deepen our understanding of how participatory planning could go at our organization, maybe brainstorm a little bit on who's taking part now and how that might shift to improve our process. And then we're going to talk about some ideas for having some tough planning conversations with the board of directors. I wanted to just kind of flesh out, just to give us some examples of questions that we might, real specific questions that I might bring to today's conversation and be thinking about. And I would encourage you all, and we'll have time for you to break out and come up with your own sort of, what are the challenges facing my organization? So we can have that thread as we think about how do we apply planning to those conundrums. So how do we plan while the future is uncertain? We have sure been in the future is uncertain times lately. So now we're moving into this post-pandemic funding landscape, and that is creating different uncertainties than the pandemic funding landscape did. We still have a tough recruiting climate. And then we also are wrestling with these fantastic investments that we made over the last few years in pay equity, and thinking about, like, how do we make those investments sustainable? Or if we haven't quite made as many as we want, like, how do we continue to do that work? Second kind of body of questions I'm thinking about is, how do I decide who should be driving the planning process and who should be participating in the planning process? And how do I want to incorporate different stakeholders in the planning process? And then another set of questions that always comes up around these topics is, how do I talk to my board about this? You know, either get them to participate in the brainstorming and problem solving, or bring them along on the journey me and my leadership team have already done around where we think the future should go. And I know a couple of things that always come up with boards are like, how do I talk to my board about having a budget that's not breaking even this year because I'm spending last year's money, which is actually 2 of these bullet points. You know, how do I talk about being in a growth period, or how do I talk about spending last year's grants, other tough conversations. So we can talk about all of that today. And then I also just want to say, best laid plans. These workshops are best when people do ask questions, and sometimes we go a little bit off course, but regardless, you will get all the slides and all the tools. And so if we don't have an opportunity to touch on all of them, that's okay. Because however we spend this next hour and a half, I am sure it's going to be great. All right. So some of you joined us for last week's workshop, and we talked about this idea of financial oversight, which is really focused on, like, oh, where are we right now, and are we doing the things we need to be doing to make sure we're doing that financial oversight piece. And so last week I kind of talked about, you know, once you get that kind of under your belt, then you can really start thinking about a longer term future and the big questions of like how to make my organization not just get through the next year or pass our audit, but like how do we build a sustainable organization where I'm not maybe scrambling every year to close a budget gap or, having to have same conversations with my board over and over again. And so when we talk about our longer term planning, it's still really important to know the things we talked about last week, which are like, where are we now? Can we tell the financial story of how our work's going, what it takes to make it happen, how last year looked, how this year's looking? And then once we've got that down, we can talk about where we're going. And so what do we want to be doing as an organization? And how are we going to get there? So most of us want to do our work better or bigger. That's it would be cool to work with an organization, although they probably wouldn't need a consultant to just like stay where we are. That's not something we usually do. And so when we're thinking about that, where are we going and what do we need to get there? Really identifying, where are the certainties and where are the uncertainties. And we'll take a look at some tools that can help us kind of flesh that piece out a little bit. And one of the cool things I think about having Jemay here today, and we may have questions for them about this, is how Jemay came on board to Feast at a time of massive uncertainty and also drove some incredible success for Feast as well during that period of time. And so there were a lot of points, I imagine, where Jemay was wrestling with that idea of like, what do we know and what don't we know? Where do we have to change? And how far in the future can we afford to look right now? And Jemay, I'll just remind you, pop in anytime. But we'll have some points, some places where Jemay will story tell. All right, so let's do a little bit of a breakout. We're going to take a couple minutes. Let's see, 10 people. Yeah, we'll break you out. I'm going to break you out into 3 groups and have you just kind of get your voice boxes and context kind of going this morning and think about what are uncertainties or challenges that you're facing in your organization as you're planning for the future. And then would love to have you come back and kind of share what's the same and what's different for your groups. All right, let me do a little quick breakup here. So one of the things that I like to do with organizations when we are thinking about long-term planning or we're thinking about like, what are those big challenges? We always have so many things like the person who just shared, sorry, I missed your name, but thinking about like recruiting, sustainability, fundraising, like those are always on our list, right? Is figure out how to fundraise for this thing. How do we last over the long run when we don't have a exact formula that's the same every year for how we get money in the door? And then, we are at the whim of an economy that we don't have control over, trends in hiring, the Seattle market, which is just very challenging to keep up with. So these are things that are always there. And so what I like to think about is this idea of a headline story. And I've also, when I was in the trenches for many years as the chief financial officer at Fair Start and went through many budgeting and strategic planning and processes. And at Fair Start, we decided to start calling our strategic plans strategic guardrails. So that's the other way I like to think about this idea, but just always, it's not everything, but what is sort of that headline story? Like, what's the big story of the next few years? So, maybe it is really getting back to like, well, what would we focus on? If we get additional funding, would we keep doing the same thing or would we change it up? And how would we decide to change it up? That's a great headline story. For some of the clients that I'm working with where some of their funding has dried up, but they still have need as, their headline story might be, innovative ways to fund our work. So now thinking, since you've identified some ways in which, questions in your organization might relate to this long-term planning, I'd love to have you also think and share in the chat box what your headline story might be, and would love, Jemay, if you would share around this at all, that would be great too. I don't want to put you on the spot too much. But as we're thinking about,
I'm
go
here
ahead.
to be put on the spot.
Yeah, you're on the spot.
So little background story when we talk about where are we now or where are we going. It's like, where have I been? I started at Feast the last week of September in 2019. And so kind of first day in the door, highest priority was our big fundraiser that was happening and starting the budget. It was like already budget season by the time I had started. So this was like my first order of business. And it was also my first time being an executive director. Up to that point, I had managed budgets that were maybe about a tenth of the size of Feast's budget. And while I was like, I've had great experience in this, I haven't had to set. I was, doing programming. And so now I was really responsible for all of the pieces of the budget that make it come together. I came in with this vision. So talking about like balancing our reality with our aspirations, I came in with this vision that I really wanted to focus on like my internal team development and pay equity goals first, and then like, get the house in order and then really get a handle on more of the external things. And I remember that process very intimately because being new, I felt a little more cautious about like coming in right away and making big changes before I'd had a chance to really talk to everybody. So in the process of budgeting that year, I remember coming to the board and being like, well, I want to raise salaries still, even though at that point we were probably like 3 months operating expenses in the bank. And I was also like, hey, just don't mess this up. Like I'm coming in thinking like, just sustain, that will be a monumental task. And then I kept asking the board, so like if I want to still do some pay increases and get this goal started, what do you all think? They're like, that's a you decision. So I was really appreciative of my board in the moments where I may have given away some of my power around my own vision, for them to say, this is actually where like our line of decision making is, and this is where you actually have a lot of say in how this goes. So I appreciated them kind of uplifting me in that way. And then kind of how Amy was saying, it's like the budget's great till the ink dries and then anything can happen. So I made what we grew to call cautiously ambitious budget. I made like small increases to salary, not having a budget tool that would show me if I increase salaries this year, what will that cost me over the next 4 years, like I have now, thanks to Amy. And, still just having general uncertainty. And then 5 months later, COVID came. So that actually dramatically changed the way that Feast work looked. We were primarily running a cooking program after school and also having an advocacy program where we advocated for changes to school food. And at that point, schools were closed and we were able to be in schools, which was our primary place of programming. So we had to do a lot of pivoting. And we did that more so from a grounded place of saying, what can we offer now? And me being able to look at the parts of the budget that were flexible and redirect them into our newly established grocery program, which was one of our first immediate responses to the COVID crisis. And so, yeah, there was a lot that was kind of shifting for me in that moment. We experienced a lot of financial growth during that time because of the work we were doing being so compelling to community, and because we received a significant amount more individual donations also than we had ever received. And it was after that point that I was able to work with Amy to say, hey, myself and my board are really committed to continuing our pay equity work. Over time and through our strategic planning, we established a goal that we wanted to get our whole team to 70K floor of salary or higher. But the questions, especially for the board, were like, if we make these big investments, how is this going to impact us? We've had big financial growth, but we've also, we're also talking about increasing our expenses. And that's when Amy came in and helped design this tool with drivers that fit for my program. So then I was able to actually show the board projections or models to say, hey, if we increase staff salaries 25% for the next like 2 years, that will get us to the goal. And here's, the difference between what type of funding we think we have coming in and what we might need to raise, or, which pots of money do we have that to come from, or our board decided to use a strategic board designated reserve of funding from previous years to carry into a future year to kind of balance our budget and help us continue to pursue these goals. So whereas I started out my pay equity advancement in a more cautious place, making smaller increases and kind of being like, let's see how this goes. We have a plan, but anything can happen, to being able to say, we're going to raise this 25% for everyone. We're going to take these bigger leaps. The story we're telling is that we're investing in our staff, because that is how we nourish our work. And they are directly the people who are working with our young people, and we pay our young people as well. And their salary, or not salaries, but their stipends for participation also increased alongside of the staffs. And so really able to be more confident in modeling out for folks, this is what that looks like next year and the year after and the year after that, so that we were able to make more grounded and intentional decisions and get towards our goals faster.
Such a cool story. I got very excited just to reliving it with you, Jamae. And I'm actually going to go ahead and I would love to have folks ask Jamae questions about their experience taking on this big strategic goal and how it went. And then also we're going to just look at some pretty Excel spreadsheets while we do it. And so we created a really specific tool for Jamae and for Feast as part of the financial coaching program in Communities of Opportunity, which was really cool. And also, so now we've got this sort of generic multi-year model that we can use for other folks and share with you today, of course. Let me pull it up. So there's a few.
Can
so
I add, Amy, while
yes,
you're
please.
pulling that up?
Yes.
For those of you, so I gained a lot of experience in the finance world pretty rapidly through the process of navigating all of this. And I feel that the process of budgeting for me now feels light years away from how it did in that first year, in great part thanks to this tool. And also, this tool was a great support when I was thinking about adding staff. So when you're talking about not only what the cost of that salary is, but the other additional benefits and how that looks year over year when you start doing cost of living increases for that staff member, this model really helped me be able to back up and tell the story of why I decided to hire a finance and operations manager and create that new position at Feast for the first time, which has been such a helpful, supportive position. And if folks are thinking about doing that, that is something I would love to talk to you about and share my experience if that's of interest.
Very cool. We're actually, let me back up. Let me start here. So when we're talking about where we start when we're looking at multi-year planning, I like to encourage folks to just really get grounded and get context and write stuff down. And so Excel can be a very scary thing, and it can also just be a real simple place to gather your thoughts. And so I put together this budget planning tool to demonstrate how you might gather context. So this is just an easy way to look at key numbers from past years. So to take a look at some big headline revenue and expenses. Many of us, I think, probably use QuickBooks. It's really one of the most affordable tools we have out there. And what we know about QuickBooks reports is like they come out in a lot of detail. And so, one of the hard truths of doing planning is like sometimes you just got to create some manual tools in Excel. And the and so this is just a sort of a summary of like, okay, got some basic categories for revenue, got some basic categories for expenses. Let's look at how they've grown over time. I always like to include my cash balance at the end of the year, along with, these income statement, revenue and expense categories, because we're all very focused on how much cash we've got. And then also include some key metrics that kind of give context to expenses or revenues going up or down, which is always how we're serving our community. And so maybe we've got some easy statistics, number of classes or number of programs or number of people served. For our modeling purposes, it's important to kind of figure out how much our programs cost in some way or another. So while I want to acknowledge that metrics dehumanize the work we do, for the purpose of figuring out costs going forward, it's helpful to use that just for that purpose in this context. And then to look at some personnel, I love the way Jemay and Feast really prioritized the people first before the program growth. I mean, wouldn't that be wonderful if we all could do that? Because it feels like we increase the programs and then, try to justify hiring the people after. But and what a way to break that cycle of scarcity. It's very cool. So get some historic numbers for some context, and then really write down what your assumptions for next year. So this might be your headline story. It might be those big challenges you're dealing with. You might categorize them like this, like, here we want to grow, or hey, no, this year we're just going to stick to our knitting and rebuild our infrastructure, or something like that. Or maybe we've got a big leadership change happening. I'm just peeking at the comments too. And then maybe we've got some specific strategic priorities we want to include. Maybe we know something's coming up, like we're going to get rid of our office space and go fully virtual, or we know that there's a lot of inflation going on right now, and we know we need to figure out how to address that. We might even put up some of the uncertainties, which is like we're making some big bets on a couple of big grants, and things will really change if that happens. So that can kind of be a tune-up of, well, we're going to make our budget with, assuming that this is going to be a yes, but hey, board, we'll have to come back mid-year if we don't get those and come up with a different plan. And you might even want to build some contingency plans really specifically in here where you outline this as part of your, this would be part of your initial planning conversation with your board or your staff, where you say, hey, plan A is all things happen the way we want them to. And then plan B, so we'll have to look at a different plan if a particular piece of funding doesn't come in, we can't make it one of or two of our strategic hires, we don't get the office space we want, we don't get the partnership with Seattle Public Schools, things like that. And then it's good to have a contingency plan for a good swing, like we get the we get the super duper big long shot funding that we're applying for, and that really changes the way things go for us. So this is a way to kind of bring the context together for your planning kind of work to do ahead of time. And then this is the multi-year modeling tool that Jemay and I worked on developing for Feast. And it's a lot to go through in a workshop. I'll show you an email at the end. One of the things that Communities of Opportunity provides, along with the workshops and financial coaching in my arena, is a finance helpline, which is ultimately where I'm just using my email right now because I'm the operator behind the helpline, where we can have an email exchange that's pretty brief, or you can request an in-person conversation, and we can, have an hour-long Zoom to talk through how you might apply this to your work. So, but we're going to send this to you, and so if it would be useful, we can follow up later. So this is a model where, again, we're looking at kind of the history. Maybe we've got our next year budget. Then we're going to take a look at 2 years out. And you could extend this to be as many years out as you want, as much history as you want. This model is set up to say, hey, some things change in percentages, and then some things are in dollars. And then your levers can change with some basic formula changes. This is set up right now so that all the yellow boxes are entry boxes and the gray are formulas that automatically calculate. And it moves through sort of the big things that matter for an organization, but you can customize this part too. So main income streams, personnel, how many folks do we have? How many folks do we want to have? What is their average salary? What do we want their average salary to be? This one's set up right now to basically say, right now we've got 9 people and we pay them $75,000, but in a couple of years we want to have one more person, but we also want to increase this by 10%. So you could set this up to have different things be the input, and then the opposite be the formula. But this is the idea behind multi-year planning, is ultimately to figure out what those levers are. What are the things that you want to play around with and see how it all adds up, and then what things are given. This is set up to increase your revenue by percentages over a year, but you could just set it up the other way and hard code stuff in there. And it goes through different areas like that. This is a program area that's set up for 2 programs, where you are kind of guessing at the number of people served, and then you kind of have an idea for how much it costs to serve each person, and that's what generates your program costs. This is an example of a program where we're just going to spend $15,000 to pilot it, and then we're going to double it after that. A couple formulas in here for thinking about finance or fundraising and administrative costs. This is based on a percentage of total income. Once you start to look back at trends to kind of figure out what is that cost, you'll have your own numbers that make sense here. And then it all rolls up down to the sort of this little tiny income statement that shows you what your total income, total expenses, and then your net gain or loss are for the period. And so in this, we're playing around here. What we can see is like, starting with these changes starting next year, we're going to have a loss here, which might be okay because we might have some funding to cover it. But maybe by 25, 26, our board's like, we want you to be breaking even again. So this tunes us up like, hey, okay, well, we can't quite do everything we wanted to do. Actually, this math doesn't even quite seem right here, does it? Yeah, we're having a much bigger loss, I think. I just did this today. Yeah, these are giant losses. Sad. So it'll take a lot more to do everything we want to do. And so then when we have these big losses, we can go back up here and say, well, if we're going to be spending almost $2 million, then we'll have to raise more than 600,000. How do we get that to happen? So that's a brief run through of the model. And I know that was a little rushed, but please take advantage. I would love to talk to every single one of you on the finance helpline about how we could tweak this to work for your organization. And I'm going to circle back, Jamae, and put you on the spot again, because love your comment about hiring a finance person. And, that is a big decision for folks to make, but we would love to hear how it really did change things for you. Would you mind sharing a little bit more?
Sure.
Shout out to Cece.
Yeah, shout out to Cece, who is our incredible finance and operations manager at Feast. It was a decision that probably took me, Cece's been on the team about 2 years now. Took me 2 years to make said decision. And a big part was because, especially during COVID, I was trying to stay as lean as possible, but also trying to make sure that we had as much staff as we could. It was difficult to hire and things at that time. But it was really great once I was like, okay, I'm feeling the need for this, also recognizing how much a proportion of my time was going into, looking at reports, working directly with our accounting team that we outsource and contract with. It just was significant. And then going through things like audits and also how the budget relates to our grants and all that different tracking. It was just significant work. And so I was able to, work with great coaches to not only come up with like, hey, what do I need? But then how is this going to translate into the budget? And so I was able to, one year I proposed, hey, I'm looking to hire a finance manager next year. When we start our budgeting process, I usually start with kind of like my vision and also what assumptions I'm making about the year and what big changes to expect for the year ahead is kind of how I start that conversation with the board. And one of those was the finance manager. And since hiring for that position, we work very closely together, and they also work very closely with our development director. I think it supports both of us in our director level roles, to be able to generate reports quickly, to be able to have more dashboards maintained for grants so we can more quickly see what's spent down, what's left to spend, where is their flexibility. This person's been able to work directly with our program team so that they can have more updated reports and see more real-time numbers about what their spending is in different categories and where they might be able to shift money into emerging priorities. Our finance manager wholly supports us in going through auditing processes now and helping us maintain our financial controls, which had to change a little bit to incorporate them into the process. Our finance manager also helps me by updating our budget template. We're working with the template that Amy created, but updating it with last year's numbers, or I'm able to say, hey, for some of these administrative costs, let's, get last year's actuals in and add some percent for inflation, and just gets me to a good baseline where then I can see, okay, what can I play with? What kind of investments do I want to propose this year? And how much is it going to take to raise it? So then I'm able to bring that story to the board to start our budgeting conversations. But happy to answer more questions about that. Or I know that I certainly was grateful for folks who had hired positions like this, who were really supportive in helping me think about what does the job description for this person look like, and what are my needs for the future, and how can this role really support our whole team. And so happy to pass that on.
Thanks for sharing that, Jamae. Are there questions, curiosities? I'm going to go ahead and just please jump in if you want to.
A quick question.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, this person that you hired in the finance role, are they full-time, part-time? Do you come across people that would work less than full-time? Like, for example, if we needed a part-time or less than part-time finance person, I'm wondering if someone would be willing to take that on.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was something that I really had to grapple with in creating this position. Because at first I was like, well, this is kind of an admin position. It's going to be difficult to get a lot of grantors to want to fund a role like this, unless it's a capacity building grant or something like that. And so, yeah, lost my train of thought because I was thinking about and also advocating to funders for more general operations funding. Yes, important work. Oh, so back to that. I started talking with some of our supporters in the finance world, and they were like, there are consultants. This is kind of like what they can do for you, and this is kind of like where you might run into some limitations, or you might need to also take on different sets of work. Ultimately, I think I asked for a lot of feedback from our community and from our board and from our accountants, who were like, you need a full-time person. Just make it happen. And I was like, you're not lying. And you also know us and our finances and our needs well, and see how much time it takes. So people that encouraged me to go ahead and go full-time out the gate, thank you. However, I think if that was not a possibility, if we didn't have the money to invest in that role, that even starting somebody part-time could be very beneficial. And I did encounter a lot of folks who were interested in that type of work as well. But I think when you're talking about your sustainability over time for your organization, for your energy as a leader and all those things, that getting a full-time person in this role really helps and ultimately can save you time and money and give you peace of mind. So I think, anywhere that you can start, it's helpful. For me, it was also helpful to combine aspects of the finance role with operations support that we also needed. So I can tell you CC stays pretty busy between all of between those roles, that we, had needs across our organization that were able to be fulfilled by that position. And I think for me, when looking also, I'll add, when you're having somebody who's doing finance and operations, in my hiring process, I was kind of gravitating more towards somebody who had the finance skills I needed and operations secondary, because I figured most of the operational stuff was more trainable. And I was looking for somebody to come in and add to our financial expertise. So that was more of the skill set I was looking for in hiring, who is somebody who has a great foundation that we can also train up in the operational needs of the organization. And CC had both. Fantastic.
Thank you. That was so helpful.
I know it's true for Feast and true for a lot of organizations where you might start out by adding an outsourced firm, right? Where you've got someone to kind of do your accounting that supports your audit work. There's a lot of great organizations out there. You just kind of got to shop around. Some of them are full up right now, but they'll always be willing to give you referrals to other trusted folks. And what you find, so cool to have an outside firm or group of folks doing it because they're experts and they know how to, or like they've seen it before. One of the challenges with an outside firm, an outside bookkeeping group, is that because they have multiple clients, they're not around all the time for you. It might take them a few days to get back to you on a question. And they're really they're accomplishing a scope of work that was agreed on beforehand. What I've seen in organizations for sure at Feast was the opportunity to really partner with a finance person, to have them sort of be shoulder to shoulder with you in these conversations and questions is super valuable. Really I think about it it's almost a gift to get yourself as the executive director, is to have that someone to talk through those with. And it's harder when you've got an outside organization. So I like to think about it as like a journey, right? Like steps you add over time when you can afford it. Or make it a priority. Barbara?
Yes. Hi. Thanks for the information. That was really excellent, because I was wondering about the workload and exactly what that individual is doing, whether it's just all financial, but you split it up between the operations and finance. And then Amy, you came along and mentioned about the outside source. And I just is that a progression that an organization, especially where you're just developing, you're receiving these grants and the accountability to them. So is that just a progression that an organization may go through? They might wind up taking the first step as having an outside entity. And then, because I feel like at this point, we need someone in-house, maybe not full-time yet, but just to get them in-house to do some of that work and build that relationship. Because the outside, like you said, it may take 2 or 3 days before they get back to you or meet a deadline, or they miss a deadline. So you have a number of different concerns. And so I was just thinking, is that just a natural progression of some organizations?
I can't speak for all, but I can say for us, it was a progression. Feast is 15 years old now, but we were fiscally sponsored and became incorporated in 2015, although we were started in 2008. So that was already a big change to go from being fiscally sponsored to being a 501c3. We contract our accounting out with the same firm we worked for many years, who's amazing. And then, so that was already happening. And then I was noticing, you know, especially starting out during COVID, I was having needs to make decisions. I'm like, you know, how spent down is this grant right now? You know, how much funding are we looking to raise? You know, how much can I write for this budget for these particular positions? That, and knowing like what levels everybody is already funded. Like, it's so helpful to be able to have that kind of point in time. Because yeah, I can't, it would slow us down significantly for me to wait 3 days to get, you know, the last finance report, or to know that our numbers are like most updated at the time when I'm making that decision. So I am really grateful to be able to say, you know, let me check let me check these numbers first before I make other decisions that affect our financial future. And it feels really supportive and reassuring, that we actually have multiple eyes on all the moves that we're making.
So do you still have an outside accounting firm as well?
We do, and that's not something I intend to change in the near future unless I had to.
Mhm. Okay.
But I think for that, for my next areas of growth, I'm going towards HR. That's a different workshop.
Oh, I know. I hear you on that also.
I feel good now where we're at with this part. Now we'll move on to another administrative area,
Yes.
which
So,
also our operations, finance operations
Mhm.
position does support me with a piece of HR as well,
Oh, that's
like
good.
research on benefits and things like
Mhm.
that.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, both of you.
And that's, I think it's a really common thing, speaking as a finance person, who's often overseen administration, HR, operations, and different functions like that. It's pretty common that, you know, a finance person would have some experience in operations. And so it's another plug for thinking about hiring for full-time for growth. I think you can definitely find part-time finance folks out there also. Maybe, you know, if you have an organization that you're closely associated with or partner with, you could go in on one and have them split between a known friendly organization out there. But yeah, I know a lot of folks, part-time work is great for them also. You just got to be patient and make sure, you know, it's a person that fits with your values. I think that's Jemay and Feast did a great job in their hire for sure. Okay, let's see. Please continue to ask questions as you'd like, but I'm gonna go back to the slideshow a little bit and just move on to a new topic. I wanted to hit on just a couple of notes. What I want to oh, I don't remember. There's something so important. Oh, I just wanted to go through a couple things thinking about that multi-year planning. My brutal truth about planning, and Jemay referenced it also. But one thing to make sure you're remembering is that your plan will almost always be different than your reality as soon as the printer ink dries. It's just the truth. And you know, because of the way we do board governance, right now we are in a culture in our organizations where if we're a 501c3, we probably have a board that passes the budget. And it's a good idea from a governance perspective to stick with that budget. But there's lots of ways to manage what happens after that ink dries when you have change too. And I think I have a slide about that. The other thing to remember about planning, whether it's budget or multi-year, is to be clear and state your assumptions. When things start to change, or 2 years down the road, after you've sort of built this model for growth, you're going to have a hard time remembering what you were thinking when you did it, right? And again, the model changes. And so when you want to go back and say, hey, you know what? Things are not quite happening the way we thought they were going to happen. It's great to be able to go back to that tool and say, oh, you know what? We assumed this. I have just this little story of this organization that their financial model was based on, they represent organizations in Washington state that are in a certain sector, and their financial model that some real fancy consultants came in and built for them with some funding years and years ago, had this faulty assumption in it. And fortunately, the model was clear and stated the assumption, but when things were not happening the way we thought they were, what we realized is that a big part of the model was based on this idea that there was a limitless number of potential members that could be charged to participate in this community work going forward. But the truth was that in Washington State, there was a finite number of groups doing that, and that they kind of saturated the market in the state of Washington for those. And so it was great to be able to go back to the model and say, oh, the reason this isn't working out this way is because this assumption turned out to not be true. And so now we've got to come up with a different model. So helpful to make sure you're getting clear about your assumptions. And then using your headline story or your guardrails helps keep you focused on the big goal and reminds us that we've got to invest to achieve it. And it can really help leaders keep their board on task too. So using something like that context tool to bring the board into the conversation early and say, hey, this is what we're agreeing on, this is what we're heading for. These are our guardrails. This is our headline story. And then when you start to bring the specific stack, specifically like the investments, you can bring them back to like, hey, remember we agreed on step 1. And so in order to achieve step 1, we really think we got to do 2, 3, and 4. So it can be a great way to bring people back. And we already looked at that tool. So I just wanted to look at that beautiful feast family there. I love it. And so I realize I'm going fast, but I had to back up just because I wanted to cover those caveats to planning.
Did you want me to share anything here? Because I was just going to back you up and say,
yes, please.
Yes, things do change. And, my first year of budgeting wasn't expecting COVID. I was budgeting in-person expenses, and we ended up doing everything virtual for the next pretty much 2 years. An assumption I'm making this year is that we'll be doing an increasing or maintaining 100% in-person programming if we can, and also maybe making some adjustments for times that we've had to go virtual. For example, if COVID is going around, so maybe that would mean having a meeting be virtual instead of in person. So I'm actually kind of planning now for the potential of having a mix of in-person versus virtual programming. Also, I've been planning for the growth of our staff over the past couple of years. This last year, I had planned to hire 2 new positions, and we were only able to find the correct fit to hire 1. So that also impacted how our expenses turned out for the year, and in some categories being lower than expected. And so even though sometimes we plan for growth and plan for expansion, there are external factors going on that can change that reality and then your budget.
Thank you. That's so, yeah, I love that. And I think what it reminds me of too is when you're talking about the reality of what happened, to make sure you're using narrative there too, right? Because I think about that, what Jamae was just talking about, planning to hire a couple people and only finding a fit for one of those positions. As a board person, you might look at that and be like, yay, Jamae saved money. And also be able to call out like, hey, you know what? Not great to save money all the time, because it means the job market's tough and we weren't able to find the right person. And this isn't savings because we're going to spend that money next year. And so stating those assumptions and then using those stated assumptions to come back and report on both the numbers, but also how you met or didn't meet it, your expectations around those things can really help keep the conversation at the level that you wanted it to. Thanks for sharing that. Yay. Okay, I wanted to just mention a couple different things. So good governance to just kind of stick with the budget and go with it. That's only true for your 1-year budget though. And there's other things that you can do, like create forecasts. So you're still reporting to say, hey, you passed a budget that said this, but then January happened and now it looks more like it's going to be this. Multi-year planning tool is also a great thing to carry through your conversation just on your your current year's performance versus budget, because you can put it in context of the multi-year thing. So it's a way to bring that conversation back to, okay, this is happening now. We're betting on this happening this year, but it looks like it'll probably move to next year. So here's how the long term looks, or here's how it impacts the multi-year look. And then also when you get into this kind of more nuanced planning, where you're like, well, I'm going to do a budget based on this big bet, and if it doesn't happen, we're going to come back with a budget amendment. Budget amendments are great ways to, I'm just making that term up because it sounds official, but you can call it whatever you want. But you might bring back like a budget revision, say, hey, if we don't get this funding, we're going to have to bring you back an adjustment. Or if we do get like the Mackenzie Phillips, or whatever her last name is, funding, we're going to have to bring you back a budget that tells you how we're going to spend all that great money. Mackenzie Scott. I think Mackenzie Phillips is part of Wilson Phillips. I'm not sure anyway. I'm getting old. All right. So I wanted to mention that. We're going to shift gears for a second here and talk about who takes part in your budget process. And what I'm getting at there is Jamae has already referred to bringing the board into the conversation at various points. So I'd love to hear from you. And I think Jamae has some thoughts to share too on bringing other staff leadership into the budget process. So would love to hear from people in the chat. Who takes part in your budgeting process right now? And Jamae, if you want to share while people are typing, that'd be great.
So I mentioned that every year I think the budgeting process is, of course, always ongoing. All year long, I'm noticing, hey, we put money into this category. It was or it wasn't enough. Just noticing like, where do we start kind of drawing from buckets of money that we thought, hey, maybe we were going to have a certain set of events that it turned out we didn't have staff capacity for, but we're having more in-person events at schools. And so we need more money to feed more young people that are coming to these larger events. And so just taking notes of all that stuff all year long. And our finance person, again, is also a really great person who sees these changes, who's working also with our different teams too, and is tracking with me, like, what are these categories that we should look at adjusting for next year. And then usually in the fall time, the finance person and I get together and we kind of start with our baseline template. So, there's sections of our budget template that talk about last year's salaries, and then it can show me projections for 4 years. So we need to make sure that every year we're getting the previous year's numbers in the right set so that the models are projecting out in the correct timeline. And then we're making those adjustments for those categories, looking at all the notes we're getting about, the cost of benefits increasing, or MailChimp's raising their prices, every little thing under the sun, and starting to populate those where they go in the different tabs of the budget. And then I'm also having that conversation with my board, often first my board finance committee, who I meet with monthly, and then our board meetings are quarterly. So at our October board meeting, I shared with the board what my high level priorities are for the year, which is continuing to advance our pay equity goals, looking to hire more youth organizing positions, and potentially making some investments in the HR or deputy area, and being able to look at how that might cost year over year. So we kind of have a thing where we're like, what is the story that we want to tell? And often where we've landed on is this idea of like cautiously ambitious growth at first, that I think is now aspirations for ambitious growth. And in terms of growing the number of staff that we have to be able to meet our programming demand. And so that's really great. In the meantime, leading up to the time that we'll pass the budget, I have folks from the staff from each of our teams that are really talking about, like, we had a meeting with our entire program team and we said, hey, what do you feel excited about doing for next year? What needs do you see that our students have? What types of base building and community engagement events do we want to do? Do we want to start investing money in new areas, like having more events with teachers to help grow our multi-generational strategy? That's like an area of the budget that we've added. To be able to prospect, like, hey, we want to keep building relationships and be in more partnerships. How does that translate into budget items? So really just listening to what the team needs, it gives them great experience being able to be like, oh, I've never been part of a budget process before. Now I'm exposed to that, and that's leadership development for them as well. And we're able to also refine categories. So we noticed 2 years ago, it was our strategy to say, hey, we want to set aside different pots of money to be able to engage with different sets of stakeholders. Now we're saying, hey, it would actually be easier for our team if we just had a line item for events and then they got to purpose that how they wanted to. And then they were easier to see real-time spending so that they can say, hey, we'd actually rather we want to do a new event, or we need to put some more money into graduation or something like that. Then they know where the flexibility is up to the 10% budget change, 10% of a category difference. And then, if it's greater than that, then I come back in to reapprove or readjust the plan. Similarly with our admin team, our wonderful development director, and I come up with goals for how much we would want to increase individual giving. We'll look at the previous year's numbers and say, what do we think our capacity is to grow this? Are we planning on doing any big events or smaller cultivation events this year? What would it take for us to be able to put those events on? And so every team really having an opportunity to say, like, let's think big. Like, that's kind of where we're at right now. I'm like, tell me your dreams. And then I will think about what is our capacity to actually do said dreams. It's one thing to put it in the budget, but you don't want to just inflate categories if you know, like, hey, might not actually have the time to be able to focus on all of these new areas. So trying to indicate that we're going to make investments in certain areas, but trying to figure out how to right size that over time. And then assessing, did that go well? Did we have enough money in teacher engagement category? Do we need more? Did we need less? Did we end up repurposing that? So that's kind of where those conversations go throughout the year. I really then take all this information and then bring the template back in what I think is the most populated for the moment. What's really interesting about the time between like October and January when we pass the budget is I'm getting continual information about grants and things that can change my outlook from the day that I started to the day that I finished. So last year, I started out being like, how am I going to balance the budget? And then over time, the budget started balancing itself. So then I'm like, okay, now I actually do feel good about putting a larger investment in there because I can tell the board, hey, we just found out that we got a renewal or something like that. So it has shifted conversations where I was like, oh, y'all, I'm, thinking about just sustaining and maintaining, to being like, okay, that funding cliff that I'm always fearing didn't actually happen. pushing that 1 year down the line. The board finance committee and our treasurer are also great partners to me in passing the budget with the larger board, because they're who I process each of these steps leading up towards the final template that I present to the board for their final vote. They come in and really offer finance reports on our current standing that are also reinforcing what I'm saying about how is our financial health, and is it, how much risk or not is there in making larger investments over the year. They may support in presenting different parts or in providing context around the assumptions that we're making that kind of back up what I'm saying. I'm like, we're putting forward a budget that we all really believe in, and we'll walk everyone through each step of it. But they're also saying, we've been close to this process and we're really confident in this budget as well. So board members who haven't been on finance every month and seen multiple drafts can also feel confident and ask their questions, that they're doing their due diligence. And so, yeah, I think our budget process involves more and more people each year, and it has been a great professional development opportunity for our team as well, to understand how those things work. And then they're also like learning more, how does the money work and how does the money flow, and where can we make adjustments to support our work when needed.
That's awesome. Jamae, thanks for sharing that. Do you find having them along for the budget journey has them more leaned into the financial results through the year also?
Can you say that one more time, please?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering about staff as the professional development piece, since they're like really leaned into thinking about what do I want to accomplish and what it's going to take and what do students want. Then as the year goes on, do you find them more interested in like looking at the results? Like, how is it shaping up and how did my predictions come out? And do you feel like they're involved in that thinking part too?
I think so. And I think we're at a point where we're kind of doing more meaning making around that, especially having full team budget conversations, and that not just, most of the conversations of course are happening with like me and the finance folks. But to provide more exposure to that, I think gives the entire staff a bigger picture thinking about like the ins and outs of our existence. Like, there are just total other sides of the work that have to go on that make it possible for us to run amazing programming. I think that our team is also becoming more savvy and interested in our fundraising, and also understanding more about how grants work too, and certainly help us in the reporting of our programmatic results. So I do think it has been a good exposure, and it's supporting the team to also make more strategic decisions about what they would like to do moving forward. And I just think having a holistic vision about all the different moving parts of an org and why they're important.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Anyone's welcome to jump in with questions, comments. I'm going to just take us back to the slides, but that does not mean you cannot jump in with questions and comments. So great to hear about what that looks like, to have more and more people participating at Feast. Just a couple points on that concept of participatory budgeting. It is really tempting in a small organization, particularly if we don't have an in-house finance person, to just feel as the leader, like you've got to just get this done. It's a box you've got to tick, get it to the board, and move on with things. But participatory budgeting is one way that we can sort of liberate some of the finance practices inside of our organization. If we look at doing participatory budgeting as like how we do our work, that's how we do our finance work, that's aligned with the way we do our other purpose-driven work. Oh, I love that. Jamae just popped into the chat and said, we're also looking at what part of the budget we want youth to give direction on. And what a powerful thing to be able to do. And Linda, we'll talk about that in just a couple slides, because we are coming up at the end of our 90 minutes together about how you can get tapped into some of the other support through COO. As we're thinking about that, what the challenges of participatory budgeting are, well, I think like the number one thing that comes to mind is time. It's challenging, of course, to take time to take more time for our budget process, but I think hopefully you can hear in Jamae's story about how it's transformational for the process and for just the depth and reality of the things that come up when we involve more folks. One thing that does get in the way, I find in organizations, is that the language can be very inaccessible in finance. And so making sure that when we're bringing more folks in, we're also training them on the language and how to read the template, and making sure that people do feel comfortable. Already know that the more people that participate, the more accurate it's going to be. But just coming back to that idea of like, it's not easy, not saying, hey, you should do this, and if you're not, it's a failure or anything like that. Like, this is hard. It takes time and resources, but it is worth it I think Jamae talks about this sort of progression of like involving another layer here and then another layer the next year. And then it can be kind of a gradual piece.
I wanted to add too, when
Yes.
I'm sharing, and maybe this comes up for some of you around concerns of like, you don't want all of your staff to see all the other staff salary information, or, there's confidential information contained in the budget. So our budget template is broken out in different areas of work. So it's administrative, the programming, the personnel, the fundraising, they're all different tabs in the budget. So when I'm inviting people in, I'm mindful that I'm only sharing the program tab, the program team. Personnel is separate, and we keep that information confidential. So only like myself, our finance person who runs payroll, and our treasurer really see that part. But the program team sees that piece. Our admin development team looks at the individual giving and the grants and the income piece. So really actually being mindful to divide those things up based on your org's ethics and vision and values.
Yeah, absolutely. Such a great point. Lots of ways around that. I'm just gonna switch slides because we are kind of wrapping up, and would love to hear from folks about their final questions. But before we lose, before everyone has to pop out, I did want to we are kind of getting to the end. I might pop into there's a couple of other exercises in the tools that you'll see. One is just a layout of how you might do a SWOT analysis for ideas about how to incorporate people. And the other one's if you read through it, you'll kind of get the idea. It's sort of a risk management approach you might take with the board, like as you're planning. So just some ideas for how to incorporate people if you don't want them, like if you don't want a group of people really in the spreadsheet, just some conversational ways to get people into the planning conversation. So I wanted to just take an opportunity before we take questions to just say thank you so much to Jamae. There's a link in here to Feast, so you can go check out what's happening at Feast. Very cool videos in there I was watching over the weekend. And then I also want to thank you, Alyssa, for doing the workshop support, and Caroline for being here in support. So we do have this finance helpline opportunity that's open to all of you, which is the process for doing that, which will be in the follow-up email where you'll get the tools too, is just to email me at amy@amythecoach.com, because I'm the finance helpline person, and you can ask me questions over email. If you're interested in talking to a couple other folks, I think some folks from last week's session, we were thinking about having like another maybe Friday noons kind of drop-in conversation to talk about what's going on in our orgs, or you can have a one-on-one conversation with me and we can walk through the tool. You can reach out to Sarah Tran, Sarah at SAMApraxis.com to talk about finance coaching. I do the finance coaching, and I can help connect you with Sarah as well. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today and for sharing. And please do look for the follow-up emails with the tools, and please do reach out. Would love to chat with any of you again. Thanks.